Aloha and welcome to Talk Story with Keli'i Akina on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Keli'i Akina. How corrupt is Hawaii's government? To answer that question today, I'll be talking with retired federal public defender and government ethics advocate, Alexander Silvert. We're going to explore one of the most consequential political controversies facing Hawaii today, the unresolved paper bag bribery allegation involving an unexplained $35,000 payment to an unidentified influential state lawmaker back in 2022. This issue has absolutely captured public attention. It's reignited concerns about ethics and accountability in state government, and it's now the subject of both public petitions and a state investigation. Mr. Silbert has been in the forefront of exposing crime and corruption in Hawaii. Perhaps you recall the mailbox scandal that he was very instrumental in bringing to the public's attention. He calls for transparency and comprehensive inquiry in what's going on today. And he'll help us to understand the facts, the stakes, and what this means for the future of governance here in the state of Hawaii. Alexander, welcome to the program.
Great. Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you on board. At the outset, can you help us establish what's really going on? Could you explain in your own words what the so-called paper bag bribery allegation is all about and how it first came to the attention of the public?
Well, in 2022, Ty Cullen was convicted and sentenced for taking a bribe. And in that investigation by the FBI, he became an informant and he recorded several conversations with other people as part of that service. There was a memo filed by the United States Attorney in 2023 for his sentencing hearing, which was under seal, meaning the public didn't get to see it at the time. But that memo became public in March of 2025. And as a result of that, for the first time, we learned of these recordings and of a recording of somebody giving $35,000 in a paper bag to an unknown legislator. And that kind of has set off this conundrum and this investigation of, well, who is that legislator? What really happened? Is that legislator still sitting either in the legislature or in the executive branch? So it was the disclosure of that memo in March of 2025 that has set all of this off.
Well, that detail of the money being handed over in a paper bag, $35,000 in particular, has become quite the icon of what's going on. What does that gesture generally imply in terms of ethical terms?
We didn't know about the paper bag until November of 2025. That wasn't contained in the memo. That came out in the letter from Mr. Sorensen. And that description of something being handed over in a paper bag obviously connotates more than, kind of like this is a bribe. If it were checks, campaign checks, you would hand over 5 or 6 of them, maybe you'd put them in an envelope. But handing over $35,000 in a paper bag certainly connotates ill will. It connotates a bribe. So that one description really has set things off as to what really happened in that transaction.
At least in the public, where we may not follow the legal nuance so carefully, there's been some confusion as to the jurisdiction of this case. Is this a federal case? Is it a state investigation? Is it both or something hybrid in between?
Well, initially, it was part of the federal investigation because the federal investigation, as we've learned through the memo that was released and letters from Mr. Sorensen, the acting United States Attorney, is much broader. It didn't only encompass that transaction, but it encompassed looking at the briber, the person who's giving the money, and whether that person bribed other legislators, because that's specifically mentioned in the 2022 sentencing memo. So their investigation is really broad, but it was made very clear by Mr. Sorensen that it did not involve what the legislator did in taking the $35,000. Mr. Sorensen made it clear that part of the investigation was over, which is why there's been this shift to having the state conduct an investigation. And so the state now, the Attorney General's office, is conducting an investigation into that one transaction, which also has now encompassed the Campaign Spending Commission, because now that the Lieutenant Governor has disclosed that she accepted two checks in the amount of $10,000, but didn't disclose that in her reports until only recently. The Campaign Spending Commission is looking at that aspect of the case.
Well, it certainly drew a great deal of public attention when the lieutenant governor acknowledged herself that she might be the unnamed lawmaker that has been referenced in the investigation. What is your view on her statements, and how should the public interpret them?
I think it's important to really understand this one aspect. No one knew of her involvement until she herself inserted herself in the investigation by coming out with that statement. Up until that point, we had no idea who this legislator might have been. And it may not even be her. We still don't know. But her coming forward because she was about to be confronted by Civil Beat over the two checks and the $10,000 and not reporting it really has now thrown this in a whole new direction.
Going back a bit, why has the identity of the lawmaker remained undisclosed publicly so far? And what kind of harm do you think that does, or uncertainty, to public trust?
At least for the FBI investigation, and I know this from 35 years of working in the Federal Public Defender's Office, when there's an ongoing investigation, they don't disclose information regarding that investigation. And you see this all over in national news when there's a big crime. Law enforcement generally doesn't disclose what they're doing and who they're looking at. So up until that point, we really didn't understand what was happening, and it was properly not disclosed. But then when the U.S. Attorney disclosed in letters to the Speaker of the House that he was no longer investigating that one aspect of the case, that's what makes now disclosure on the state side so much more important, because this could be a sitting legislator who's currently sitting and acting on laws that are pending before the legislature to clean up campaign spending, to close loopholes, to extend statute of limitations for bribery and campaign spending violations. So now, more than ever, it's important that we know who this legislator is.
Can you tell us about the petition you circulated? What was it calling for, and what is the outcome of that petition?
In March of 2025, when we learned of this sentencing memo, I kind of was watching to see what was going to happen, what was going to be the reaction among the powers that be, among the legislature. And unfortunately, what I saw for 6 or 7 months was no reaction. Other than Representative Souza and Representative Bellotti, it didn't appear that there was any reaction or effort to uncover and look into this matter whatsoever. So I decided that under the rules of the House and the Senate, any citizen can launch a petition, which both houses have to at least address. They don't have to do anything, but they have to at least acknowledge the petition and address it. So I decided that would be the best course of action to move things along. So I filed that in October, and it's gotten a tremendous amount of pushback from the legislature. So that's kind of exploded the issue of the petition. The Senate, on the very first day of session, during, right after opening day speeches and congratulatory pats on the back, in the last few moments of that day, they called it, which means the clerk read it, and they killed it. Because if the petition isn't referred to a committee, it dies. So that's what they did when no one was looking. The House, the Speaker of the House, hasn't done anything. She keeps saying she hasn't decided how to handle the petition. So the petition is still alive in the House, although to me, they're looking for ways to kill it. They're looking at the right moment to kill it.
Well, from the beginning, you've argued that Hawaii authorities have a duty to investigate, even if a federal case is going on. Could you lay out some of the legal basis for this argument?
Well, as I previously said, we don't know if this is still an active member of the legislature or the executive branch or even a lobbyist. But state laws are different than federal laws. The federal bribery law has been very narrowly construed recently by the United States Supreme Court. It almost gutted it. But the state bribery law is very vital. It's a much broader mens rea in terms of intent. And so there are state laws, ethical rules, administrative rules, campaign spending rules that are still in play and may apply to the situation. So that's why it's important for the state to investigate.
A lot of people have raised concerns about the state attorney general investigating a potential high-ranking executive official. How significant are those concerns in your view?
In my view, it's very important for the state to investigate this, and they have the full authority to do it. The question is the willpower, whether they're going to do it or not, and whether the public will allow it to be washed under the bridge, so to speak. And so, to me, it's critically important that we have a fair, neutral, and independent investigation to determine exactly what happened.
Well, fair, neutral, independent, those words add up to transparency, which is what a lot of the people in the public are calling for. Do you think there should be a legislative committee or a special prosecutor or some other mechanism?
Yes, the petition calls for a legislative investigative commission. And let me explain why that's different from what the Attorney General's office is doing. When the Attorney General's office investigates something, it's a criminal investigation subject to the grand jury. And there are explicit rules under the criminal law that when you use the grand jury to investigate, everything that's done is secret. The public does not get the right to know who's been subpoenaed, what's been said in the grand jury, what documents have turned over. And unless there's an indictment, we'll never know what happened in front of the grand jury, what the testimony was, who was named. None of that will come out under criminal law. If, however, we do a legislative investigative committee, it's a public hearing. We will see and hear witnesses testify. We will know exactly what they're considering and what information they had. So there's a huge difference between the two, and that's why I keep calling for a legislative investigative committee, not an AG investigation.
Well, Alexander, let's talk a little bit about the significance and the broader impact of what's taking place in the current scandal. You certainly know everything there is to know, I think, about the famous mailbox conspiracy involving the former chief of police in Honolulu, his wife, and other officials. Do you think there's any pattern you see here as to how government officials deal with corruption?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is a pattern. Back in the Kealoha case, if you remember, Mayor Caldwell, when the investigation was happening, said, look, we can't say anything. I won't judge because we have to wait for the indictment. We have to wait for this to play out in the courts. The police commission was basically glad-handing and patting Chief Kealoha on the back because he simply told them that he hadn't done anything wrong. When the Kealohas were convicted, Mayor Caldwell turned right around and said, we don't look back, we only look forward. I kept calling on the police commission and other city and county agencies to do something, to look at what happened and make reforms. When a bridge collapses, engineers come in, they look at the reasons why the bridge collapsed, and when they rebuild the bridge, they make it better. They learn from their mistakes. Unfortunately, that did not happen either on the city and county level or on the state level after the Kealoha case. Then we had the convictions of Senator English and Representative Cullen, and we had the Foley Commission created, and they proposed a number of reforms. Many of them were passed, but most of the key legislative reforms were denied. Those reforms keep coming up in front of the legislature, and they keep getting denied year after year after year. Not one single significant reform has passed since the first year when there was all that pressure on the legislature to do anything. And now we find ourselves here once again. And so from my perspective, we haven't learned from the past. There's been resistance to real change. But once again, we have many bills, good government bills and transparency bills and accountability bills before the legislature. And those need to be passed now based upon this scandal to start closing these loopholes.
What do you think this ongoing pattern reveals about the political culture and ethical standards in Hawaii government today? I know it's commonplace to refer to classic cities like Chicago and New York and so forth when talking about government corruption. But what does all of this say about Hawaii and our political culture?
Yeah, unfortunately, following up on my previous answer, we seem to be very reluctant, at least among the leadership, to make changes and to really be concerned about this. One aspect of it is because we really have a one-party state, the leadership and the Democratic Party, and I'm a Democrat, feels very entitled and very resistant to change because they don't think they'll lose at the election poll. And because of that, we have this absolute resistance to reform. And it's going to take the public to come forward and really make that happen and force that change. I grew up on the East Coast, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York. And people used to say to me, is corruption in Hawaii worse or better than there? And I used to say, before I got involved in all of this, that, oh, are you kidding? In Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, when there's corruption, the entire sanitation department gets arrested, not just one worker, or an entire division gets brought in because they were all taking bribes. After getting more involved in local politics, I'm beginning to be concerned that there is deep-rooted corruption within our state that needs to be rooted out.
Well, that is an ominous realization. Now that the state attorney general is reportedly investigating the case with evidence from federal authorities, what should the public expect next?
As I said, we're not going to hear a lot about what they're doing or who they're interviewing or what they're saying unless there is an indictment. But in terms of speed, Governor Green went on live television and said that because the evidence had already been investigated for years by the FBI and turned over to the Attorney General's office, that this should be a relatively quick investigation that should be over by the spring. And I completely agree with that. This should be fast. They should move forward really quickly, and there should be some accountability and discussions and transparency, I would hope, in the very near future. This should not drag on. It certainly shouldn't drag on past the legislative session, because whatever result there is, it can have a direct impact on laws being passed that would correct these issues or plug the dam, so to speak, with campaign spending reform.
You mentioned timing. Are there deadlines, such as statutes of limitations, that could affect if charges can be filed?
Right. In terms of a criminal investigation, there really are no deadlines other than statute of limitations. And there is a statute of limitations running on campaign spending violations that will be over by state law by January of next year. And in terms of bribery, it'll be over by January of the following year. So there are those deadlines. There are currently bills in the legislature to change the statute of limitations for bribery and to change the statute of limitations for campaign spending violations. And hopefully those will pass this year and make it easier to bring people to justice when they commit these kinds of violations.
We all hold sacred the mandate not to judge until someone is proven guilty. But when it comes to public officials, what would you say to those who argue that we should wait for the investigation to conclude before making any conclusions about public officials, such as whether they should be reelected?
As a public defender, I'm all in favor of keeping an open mind until the evidence comes out and then taking a look at it. So in terms of pointing fingers at specific individuals and deciding they're guilty of a crime or not, I agree. That should be held off until we have the full knowledge of what's happening. But in terms of politics, in terms of campaign spending reform, in terms of bribery reform, in terms of ethical reform, that should be done right now. That can be discussed. That can be analyzed, given facts we know or facts that are going to be disclosed. And that's what the discussion should be. It should be, what can we do now to reform our laws? And that is a public discussion, and that is a correct public concern. And that's what we've been pushing forward, is transparency, accountability, and reform.
Well, what would be an ethical outcome of this episode, even if no crimes are ultimately charged?
Well, ethical outcome would be to fully understand the circumstances of what happened, even if no criminal laws were violated. Remember, a criminal law is only violated if the government can prove beyond a reasonable doubt the person's guilty. It doesn't mean a crime wasn't committed. It doesn't mean a wrong wasn't committed. It just means under the criminal justice system whether the government can prove beyond a reasonable doubt a person is guilty of a crime. But that leaves wide open the area of reform, of accountability, and closing loopholes for campaign violations and spending. So that is a wide open field, and that's where we really have to go.
Well, I like the opportunity you point out in terms of reform and accountability. Great opportunity, but there's also out there a great deal of cynicism on the part of the public, because it seems as though we've seen this and it happened, not merely the mailbox conspiracy, but Alexander, throughout Hawaii's broader history of political scandals, accountability cycles, and so forth, and reform efforts, what have you seen?
I agree that we've had scandals going back to 1997. This is not new. We have periodic scandals that come up. We push for reform. We get a little bit. Then the establishment fights back, and we seem to revert back to the norm. The reason this might be a little different, and I'm hopeful that it will be different, is because there's so much pressure on the legislature to do something that hopefully this session they can't kill every bill. If they do that, in addition to not wanting to have a legislative investigative commission, it's really going to push them into a position where elections are coming up. That's what makes this a little bit unique, I think. All the members of the House of Representatives are up for election come November. So are some members of the Senate. So we are the lieutenant governor and the governor. So we have an opportunity to really push this issue, and we have an opportunity as the members of the public to do something at the polls. I know everybody says voting doesn't matter. I don't agree with that. In my district, my House district, the representative won by less than 300 to 500 votes. If you don't think that this issue can sway 300 to 500 people to vote either for a more progressive individual or for the opposition party, I think you're crazy. I think it can. And that can happen statewide. So I'm urging voters to get out there and vote. I think your vote does matter in this election. And I think it will pressure legislators, even now, to really look at their position, because we will hold you accountable in November for how you handle this crisis.
Going back to the opportunity you see at hand to bring about reform, what kinds of reforms in particular would be most expedient? Legal reforms or procedural reforms, cultural reforms? What would you like to see take place to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future?
Well, I've talked about the legal reforms that I think have to be made. I think one legal reform that really has to be made is the change of leadership of how they operate, how they are very dictatorial in how they handle members of their own party, and the power of the chair within committees. Because as we've heard over and over and over again, a chair can kill a bill by themselves. And leadership, we've seen last year, steps in when bills look like they're ready to pass. They've passed all sides of the chambers, they've passed committees, and the leadership steps in and kills a bill. Those kind of reforms are internal within the parties, within the legislature, but nothing's really going to happen until that's been addressed. That has to be reformed.
Ordinary citizens, if they feel concerned about government integrity as a result of cases such as this and others, what can they do?
I've urged people repeatedly, you have to start emailing, writing, calling your representative, and you have to urge others to do it. They will respond to public pressure. It may be a short-term fix, but they do respond. The more people speak out, the more in their district, the more they will respond. I know it's tedious. I know it sounds boring, but it's the way we have direct democracy in action, by having people get involved and letting their representative know that they're involved and they are concerned. In addition to, of course, going to the poll. So I urge people to do that. I urge people to go to the neighborhood board and speak out, because members of the legislature, the governor's office, attend those boards. So go and speak out. It's time for us to have a voice. This is your moment.
Alexander, do you have any further thoughts for our audience? I know that we're in a time in which more information is being revealed every other day. and the case is starting to take shape. But any thoughts? Anything we should expect or look for? Anything you may know that you'd care to share?
It is, things are fluid. I mean, I had written an article last week and I had to change it by Wednesday because the lieutenant governor came out and made her statement. So things are moving fast. People need to be kept informed from whatever sources of news that they have. Every news source, you have to understand, has its own bias and own slant. So I would suggest reading a number of them and differently because they present different points of view. But one of the key things I think that, at least in my near future, I'm going to try to tackle is the Attorney General came out with a press conference the other day, and in it made the statement that she did not have the authority to appoint an independent special prosecutor. Well, 2 years ago, the Department of the Attorney General stood in front of Senator Dela Cruz's Ways and Means Committee when there was a bill pending before it, specifically to amend the law to create a special prosecutor. And the Attorney General's office, in writing, said, no, there's no need for this law because we have full authority to do that. And that person would be independent of any authority from the Attorney General. And yet, just a few days ago, the Attorney General, when asked the question, why don't you appoint a special prosecutor, told the press and told the citizens of Hawaii, we don't have that authority. So as far as I'm concerned, my next move is to try to bring this back to the attention of Senator Dela Cruz and ask him to call them into his committee to account for what they've said, to account for the fact that they killed a bill 2 years ago because they did have the authority. And I'm going to ask him to reintroduce that bill and get it passed this session, because obviously we can't necessarily believe the candor of the Attorney General on this issue.
Well, Alexander, thank you very much. I am always better informed after talking with you, and I appreciate the dedication you've shown to ferreting out corruption and explaining it to the public, as well as offering solutions. Appreciate you being on board with us today.
Well, thank you very much for letting me have this opportunity.
And to our audience, I would draw to your attention what Alexander Silvert has said about one of the opportunities for change in the future. It's when people in the public, you and me, get involved, when we call up our elected officials and we hold them accountable. I want to encourage you to do that and have the conversation, because as we add pressure to those who are in leadership, they do respond. I'm Keli'i Akina on Talk Story with Keli'i Akina on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We'll see you again next time. Aloha.